The fluorescent lights above flickered, harsh and sterile. I lay on the gurney, my chest rising shallow, breath rattling. The sharp scent of antiseptic clung to the air, pressing down. I didn't hear my daughter's voice. I heard a nurse. "Your mother's here, unconscious. Please come quickly." Then a pause. Then a reply so cold it cracked the room. "I'm busy. Handle it yourselves." That was Rebecca. My only child, my Rebecca. The girl I raised through nights of hunger. The girl I carried with aching arms when fevers burned. Now, to her, I was a file to close, a burden to postpone. I wanted to believe I misheard. But the nurse's eyes told me truth. Her lips tightened. Her clipboard trembled. Silence in the ER stretched thin, like glass about to shatter. When I woke fully, Kelly, the nurse, sat beside me. She touched my hand. Warm skin, steady pulse. She whispered, "Mrs. Lane, your daughter said she was too busy." "I'm so sorry." I stared at the ceiling. White tiles blurred into one another. Something inside me broke. Not with screams, not with tears, but with a clean, merciless snap. I thought, 72 years and this is my reward. Sacrifice erased by a voicemail tone. A goodness I felt invisible, discarded like winter slush. Rebecca's voice still rang in my ears. "I'm busy." 2 words sharper than any knife. 2 words that rewrote every memory of bedtime stories, every packed lunch, every hour I spent standing in the cold waiting for her bus. My hands curled on the blanket. Nails dug crescent moons into the thin fabric. For a moment, I almost begged, almost wished she would come running after all. But then a thought, strange and bitter, crept in. Maybe it is better this way. Maybe now I will see the truth clearly. The ER monitor beeped steadily. Life went on uncaring. But my life had just been split in two, before those words, and after. The old woman lying in that hospital bed, she was done waiting for scraps of affection. I swallowed hard, tasting the bitterness of metal and regret. I told myself, dignity is not given. It is taken back. Kelly patted my arm again. "You're not alone here," she said softly. And for the first time that day, I believed it, not because my daughter cared, but because a stranger did. I closed my eyes, listening to the hum of machines, the shuffle of nurses' shoes, the distant clang of a dropped tray. Every sound reminded me the world was moving. I could move too. I would not cry in this room. I would not collapse under the weight of betrayal. I would breathe, steady and stubborn, until I could stand again. Rebecca thought she was too busy for her mother, too busy for the woman who gave her life. Fine, let her be busy, because from this moment forward, so was I, busy finding strength where she left absence, busy building bonds where blood had failed, busy protecting what mattered, even if it meant protecting it from her. I opened my eyes, vision sharp now. The nurse caught my gaze. I managed a small, tired smile. She nodded back, silent understanding passing between us. The betrayal still burned, but beneath the burn was steel. I felt it rising slowly like heat under frozen ground. Not rage, exactly resolve. I whispered to myself, "Justice will be quiet, but it will be mine." The words settled in the air like frost melting into water. Yes, snow still clung to the window panes that night. I sat by the lamp, its yellow glow spilling across my lap, and let my mind drift backward. I was 22 again, chalk dust settling on my fingers. The classroom smelled of sharpened pencils and waxed floors. Children's laughter filled the space, high and pure, like bells swinging free in the wind. Those days were hard, yes, but they gave me purpose. I remember standing at the blackboard long after dismissal, sketching letters again and again for the one boy who struggled to read. Patience was my currency. Hope, my only wealth. When the paychecks came, meager slips barely enough to cover rent, I saved every coin. Not for myself, but for Rebecca. Her shoes always came first. I patched my own coat until the lining frayed, but she walked to school with warm feet. I skipped dinners, spooning broth while she ate the last potato. I told myself it was nothing, just what mothers do. Still, the hunger clawed late at night, sharp and unforgiving. Rebecca was only 7 when her father left. The house felt enormous then, each room echoing with absence. She would crawl into my bed, clutching my arm tight, whispering she was afraid of the dark. I told her, "It's all right, darling. I'm here." Ina and I always was. Even when exhaustion blurred my vision, Even when I collapsed at the kitchen table grading papers past midnight, I kept watch. Every sacrifice, every hour stolen from rest, I poured into building her world. I stitched costumes for school plays, baked cupcakes no one else wanted to bake, clapped until my hands stung at every recital. Her smile was enough. It had to be. Now, decades later, that smile flickers in memory, distant and grainy, like an old film reel left in the attic. I can still see her skipping down the block with ribbons in her hair, her laughter chasing away my loneliness. Back then, I thought love would always circle back. I thought devotion carved into bone could never be erased. But love is not a contract, it is a gamble. And sometimes, the very child you carried becomes the stranger who turns away. I reached for my old teaching journal on the nightstand. Its pages smelled faintly of dust and ink, the handwriting younger, steadier. On the first page, I had written for Rebecca, "May she always know she is loved." My throat tightened as I traced those words with a fingertip. The letters wavered in the lamplight. Somewhere in the distance, a clock struck, steady and merciless. I closed the book gently as if shutting a door between then and now. And yet, behind that door, the memories pressed hard, demanding to be heard. I can still taste the stale bread I ate alone, night after night, so Rebecca could have fresh fruit for her lunchbox. I can feel the Vermont wind cutting through my thin coat as I trudged to evening shifts at the library, leaving her asleep with a neighbor so I could earn a few extra dollars. Every blister on my feet felt worth it when she smiled at a new book or a clean dress. There was the Christmas I pawned my wedding ring. She had outgrown her winter jacket. I remember the shop's smell, metal, dust, and disappointment as I slid the ring across the counter. That night, Rebecca tore open the package, her eyes wide with delight. She never asked why my hands shook as I hugged her. When she won a spelling bee at 12, I clapped until my palms stung. Her cheeks glowed red, her ribbon swinging proudly. I remember thinking, this is it. This is proof the sacrifices mean something. I carried the thought like a shield. It protected me through long winters and empty pantries. The years spun forward. Rebecca earned scholarships, moved to Boston, built her name in law. Each success felt like my own. When colleagues asked why I stayed in that drafty old house, I said, because every brick holds her footsteps. I believed pride was enough to warm me. But memory is a tricky companion. It gives and it takes. I recall her voice at 16, sharp and impatient. "Stop fussing, Mom. I can handle myself." I told myself it was just adolescence, a storm that would pass. I didn't see it growing into distance, into detachment I could never repair. Now, sitting in the quiet, I see those moments more clearly. The gaps. The little silences where love should have lingered. I wonder if I mistook ambition for care, if I wanted so badly to believe she needed me that I ignored the signs she did not. Still, the image of her first day at college burns in my mind. She stood on the steps with her suitcase, hair glossy, future wide. I pressed a $20 bill into her palm, money scraped from 3 weeks of scrubbing chalkboards. She kissed my cheek, brief and distracted, and was gone. I thought distance was temporary. I thought I would always be her anchor. But anchors rust. They sink forgotten. At the bottom of seas no one sails anymore. I closed my eyes and leaned back into the pillow. The house creaked softly as if remembering with me. Warm flashbacks faded, replaced by the chill of the present. What I once called devotion now felt like proof carved into bone. That love, unreturned, can leave you hollow. Rebecca arrived 2 weeks after I came home from the hospital. Snow had melted into patches of gray slush, and the house smelled faintly of wood smoke and old books. I had brewed coffee, dark and bitter, hoping the ritual might soften the edges between us. She swept inside in her wool coat, heels clicking against the worn wooden floor. Her eyes moved over the furniture, the stack of unpaid bills on the counter, the half-empty medicine bottles by the sink. Her lips tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Mom," she said, her tone clipped. "You look fragile." The word hung in the air, dressed as concern but sharp enough to cut. I folded my hands in my lap, willing them not to tremble. Fragile. Once I had been strong enough to carry her on my back through a thunderstorm. Now she measured me against the ticking of a clock. She sat at the table, crossing her legs, setting her phone in front of her like a shield. I poured the coffee. The steam curled upward, carrying its bitter aroma, filling the silence between us. She took one sip, then set the cup aside. Too bitter, perhaps. Or maybe it was simply the company? Mom, you really should think about options. She gestured toward the pill bottles. You can't keep rattling around this old place. It's too much for you. A retirement community might be safer. Safer? That word cracked something deep inside me. I kept my voice steady. I've managed this house for 50 years. I can manage it still. But her laugh was small, but it carried disdain. 50 years, exactly. That's the problem. Time doesn't go backward. Mom. I stared at her. The same mouth that once asked for bedtime stories now pressed into a hard line, dispensing judgment. My chest tightened. Rebecca? I said softly. This house is my life. She rolled her eyes, glancing at her phone. Your life is becoming my responsibility. Don't you see that? Oh, the words struck harder than any slap. For a moment, the kitchen dissolved, the smell of coffee, the clink of her ring against the mug. And all I heard was the echo of a little girl once whispering, Don't leave me, Mommy. I blinked. She was no longer that girl. She was a woman slicing me apart with polished words. Her phone buzzed. She tapped quickly, barely looking at me. Clients need me. I can't spend my weekends babysitting, Mom. Babysitting. As if my existence were a chore. My jaw clenched. Inside my chest, anger pressed against the ribs, begging for release. But I didn't lash out. I sat still, hands gripping the edge of the table until my knuckles whitened. My silence became its own protest. Rebecca looked up, noticing my stare. What? She asked. You can't expect me to put my life on hold. You had your time. Now it's mine. Her words cracked like ice underfoot. Cold, final. I wanted to shout to remind her of every coat I patched, every dinner I skipped, every night I stayed awake so she could sleep without fear. But the words tangled in my throat, choking me. Instead, I whispered, almost to myself, I never thought love would turn into debt. She frowned. What's that supposed to mean? I shook my head. Nothing. Just an old woman's thought. The air between us grew heavier, thicker than the steam that now cooled into bitter droplets on the table. Rebecca stood, adjusting her coat. I'll check in again, when I can. Her tone suggested an obligation, not affection. Her eyes already drifted to the door. I rose slowly, joints stiff, body aching. At the threshold, she hesitated, then delivered the final cut. Try not to make things harder than they need to be, Mom. You're not young anymore. The door shut behind her. Silence rushed in like a tide. I pressed my hand to the cool wood, feeling the tremor in my fingers. In the quiet, the house itself seemed to sigh. The kettle whistled faintly, a ghost of comfort I could not touch. My reflection in the darkened window stared back at me, lined face, wary eyes, but a spark still buried deep. Her words had wounded me, yes. But beneath the wound, resolve stirred. A fragile thread of steel coiled tight. If my daughter saw me as a burden, I would not crumble. If she tried to erase me, I would carve my name into stone. The night settled heavy, and I whispered into it, Blood may dismiss me, but dignity will not. The lamp flickered, shadows stretching long across the room. And I knew the next time she came, the insults would only cut deeper. The question was whether I would bleed, or whether I would finally fight. The porch wore a crust of glittering ice. I woke before dawn, pulse steady, mind raw. By 7, the kettle sang. I set 2 cups, then put 1 away. A car door slammed. Tires chid the slush. Rebecca's shadow crossed the frosted glass. She entered without knocking, breath white, gloves already off. No hug, only the scrape of a chair. We need to be efficient, she said. Her briefcase clicked. Document sleeves fanned like cards. I brought paperwork to ease things. I poured coffee. Paperwork for what? Power of attorney, she said lightly. Plus a deed transfer and a listing prep. Signatures now will keep headaches away later. Her tone played mercy. Her eyes played math. I took the top sheet. Fine print crawled like ants. The page smelled of toner. A signature line waited hungry. I won't sign what I don't understand. Rebecca smiled, thin and polished. It's standard. You trust me? She slid a pen toward me. Its barrel was warm from her hands. Kelly's voice from the hospital rose up. She said she was too busy? I let it drift behind me like smoke. What is this line? I asked, tapping the deed. Grantor conveys all right title and interest immediately. Her jaw flexed. It's just language. The house is safer under my management. Taxes, repairs, insurance. Mom. You can't handle that alone. I have handled it, I said. For decades. Exactly. Decades. Things break, money drains. This place is a liability. A listing agreement lay beneath. Firm name neat. Commission box bright. You were ready to list. I explored options, she said. It's smart to be prepared. Prepared, I thought, the way you prepare a pasture for clearing. You could have asked me, I said. I am asking. Please sign. It's for your good. As she touched the pen to my knuckles, almost tender. For a second I saw the little girl who hid in my coat during storms. Then she blurred into this woman, efficient, impatient, an eraser with lipstick. Tell me the truth, I said. Help me, or help a deal. Both can be true. I wiped a circle in the frost on the window. A thin sun lifted over the maple, throwing pale light on the street. I have another appointment at 9, she said. Please don't make this hard. Read me the POA. Every clause. She sighed, then began, naming powers like beads on a string, banking, sale, litigation, health decisions. I stopped her at the gifting provision. This lets you give my property to yourself. That is not the intention. But it is the permission. She looked away. Law requires flexibility. Law, I thought, also requires consent. I slid the stack aside. No. Her face flushed. Mom, don't be dramatic. You're not thinking clearly. I am, I said. I survived a hospital bed. I can survive your timetable. She squared the papers with sharp taps, then produced a bank envelope. What's that? You're checking, she said. You missed 2 utilities. I covered them. She placed a receipt bearing her name on my withdrawal. From my account. How did you? You gave me the login after the pneumonia, she said briskly. I streamlined things. It was necessary. Without asking, you would have agreed. Heat rose and cooled into steel. So now you move my money. Next you move my walls. She set the envelope between us, a small barricade. Stop reading malice into kindness. Kindness asks, I said. It doesn't sign for you. The kettle clicked off. Silence settled, heavy and metallic. I felt the floorboards under my feet, a map of long years. Her phone buzzed. Clock's running, she murmured. Then hear me fast, I said. I won't sign today. Not the power of attorney. Not the deed. Not a listing. Her eyes hardened. You're making a mistake. Possibly. But it will be mine. She stood. The chair skidded back with a scrape. Pages slid into her briefcase like falling leaves. There are consequences, she said. Financial, legal, practical. I can't keep managing a mess. Then don't, I said. Goo. The word startled us both. She stared, bright with anger or pain. I could not tell which. She zipped the case. Metal teeth closed with finality. At the door she paused. I hope you know what you're doing. Do, I said, though my pulse stuttered. I know who I've become to you. And who is that? Inventory, I said. Assets. Liabilities. Not a mother. Her mouth opened, then shut. She left. Outside, a plow rattled the street. I rinsed my cup, hot water steaming around my fingers. Heat bit, then soothed. On the counter lay my old teaching journal. I opened at random. A note from years ago waited. Pay mortgage early. Keep the house safe? Safe. The words stood like a lighthouse on a black coast. I took the envelope. Inside sat a small slip of power receipt, routing number, date. Evidence has a quiet shine. I fetched a shoebox and placed the slip inside. The box already held tax stubs, photographs, the paw print of a dog long gone. I pressed the lid down until cardboard met cardboard. Later, at the desk, I found an unused checkbook, a fountain pen I loved, and the number for a lawyer a neighbor had mentioned after my fall. I dialed. The line rang. Then a calm voice answered. Good morning. My name is Margaret Lane, I said. I need a consultation about financial control and property protection. Of course, the voice replied. Can you come tomorrow at 10? I can, I said. My voice sounded steady. It sounded like a woman who believed herself. I stood by the window. Wind lifted crystals of ice from the eaves. Sunlight caught them, turning them into brief stars. I pressed my palm to the glass. Cold sharpened my thoughts. The phone vibrated. A text from Rebecca. We'll revisit this. Don't make rash decisions. I typed erased, typed again. Decisions made slowly aren't rash. I wrote, please don't access my accounts without permission. Dots blinked, no reply. Evening came early, as winter insists. I lit lamps, small islands of gold in the dim. The house warmed around me, a body tall with memory. I set a pot of soup to simmer. Carrots, onion, leftover chicken. Steam wrapped the kitchen, kind and familiar. Spoon in hand, I understood something simple. I could be alone and still be whole. I could be alone and still be safe. I sat where morning papers had demanded my surrender. Steam fogged my glasses. I took a sip and let salt and heat steady me. Then I slid the shoebox closer and lifted the lid. Inside, small proof slept, not much enough. Before sleep, I laid the pen on the table and stared at its nib, dark with the morning's almost signature. That small point had hovered over my name, ready to erase me. Tomorrow it would write boundaries instead, lines that said, here I stand, here my life remains mine. I breathed and believed. The night pressed against the panes. I listened to it breathe. And I waited for morning, when paper would meet counsel, and kindness would learn to carry its own name again. The silence in my house grew heavier after the money fight. Rebecca stopped calling altogether. Days blurred, stitched together only by the sound of my own breath and the ticking clock on the mantel. The house that once rang with laughter, with my daughter's piano practice, now felt like an empty shell holding only me. At first, I told myself she was busy. Cases, deadlines, the endless grind of city life. But even excuses run thin when birthdays pass without a call. On Christmas Eve, I waited, foolish as a child waiting for Santa. I baked the cookies she once loved, cinnamon heavy, edges crisp. The tray cooled untouched. The only visitor was a cold draft slipping under the front door. I thought about calling her. The phone sat on the counter like a dare. But I could still hear her voice from the hospital, that one sentence. I'm busy. Handle it yourselves. It wrapped around my heart like barbed wire. So I didn't dial. I chose silence, because silence hurt less than hearing her impatience again. The neighbors noticed. Mrs. Holloway from across the street knocked one afternoon with a pot of chicken noodle soup. The steam rose, filling my kitchen with warmth I hadn't felt in weeks. Cold snap coming, she said, setting it down. Eat while it's hot? I almost cried, right there. From the simple mercy of hot broth, I realized kindness didn't always have to come wrapped in blood ties, but Rebecca's absence pressed harder when family events rolled around. One Saturday, I saw cars lining the street. My daughter had driven into town after all, just not to me. She'd gone to a cousin's barbecue. I found out when I spotted her laugh, head tossed back, framed in the glow of another's porch light. I stood at my window like an uninvited ghost. No one called my name. No one waved me over. Later that night, alone at my own table, I set out a plate. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans. Food for a gathering, though the chairs around me stayed empty. I forced each bite down, the silence screaming louder than any insult. That was when it hit me I hadn't been forgotten. I'd been excluded. Winter deepened. Snow covered the mailbox so completely I stopped checking it. Why bother? Bills were the only letters arriving now. The night stretched, brittle and cold. I wore 2 sweaters to bed, yet still shivered. Sometimes, I caught my reflection in the window, a woman with hollow eyes, wrapped in a quilt too big for her body. That woman looked like a stranger I didn't want to become. And yet, light slipped in small ways. A knock at the door with fresh bread from a neighbor. A phone call from Evelyn, my childhood friend, just to hear my voice. Those moments kept me tethered. They reminded me I wasn't entirely invisible. Pain taught me who showed up when love was inconvenient. Still, the wound of my daughter's dismissal bled quietly. I carried it like a stone in my chest. Every family photo on the wall felt like it belonged to someone else's story. I was in the pictures, yes, but no longer in their lives. The house sighed with emptiness. I answered back with silence. One night, the isolation sharpened to its cruelest point. I had dressed for what I thought was a family dinner. Rebecca had sent a text, dinner at 7. I dressed carefully, hair pinned, pearls clasped. But when I arrived, the door never opened for me. I stood outside on the frozen porch, breath fogging the glass, listening to muffled laughter inside. At last, I understood. The message hadn't been meant for me. It had been a group chat where my number remained out of habit, not invitation. I walked back through the snow, each step carving the truth deeper. I was no longer welcome. That night, wrapped in my quilt, I listened to the clock again. Tick, tock, each beat said the same thing. Alone. But a different thought stirred beneath it. If I was strong enough to stand on that frozen porch without breaking, I was strong enough to stand for myself. Something quiet inside me began to shift. The isolation wasn't killing me. It was shaping me for what came next. Invitations rarely came my way anymore. So when Rebecca called one afternoon with clipped politeness, "You should come Saturday. It's Oliver's birthday," I felt both relief and suspicion. Relief because my grandson's smile had always warmed me. Suspicion because my daughter's tone carried no warmth, only obligation. Still, I went. Hope has a stubborn way of whispering, even to the betrayed. Saturday dawned gray and raw. The sky hung heavy with clouds that threatened rain but never delivered. I dressed carefully. Navy skirt, cream blouse, my old pearl earrings. They weren't new, but they carried history. My husband had bought them for our 25th anniversary. I wanted Oliver to see me neat, proud, the way he used to know me. I wrapped a small box with colored paper, a book I had saved for him, Charlotte's Web, a story about loyalty, loss, and the quiet power of small kindnesses. I thought it fitting. The party was at a rented hall on the edge of town, one of those places where balloons outnumber chairs. I parked far away and walked across gravel, heels slipping. Inside, the air smelled of frosting and plastic cups. Children darted between tables, shrieking with delight. Parents chatted over weak coffee. And there, Rebecca, sleek in black, moving from group to group like a politician on the campaign trail. She barely looked up when I entered. "You made it?" she said, brushing my cheek with air instead of lips. "Good. Could you put those coats over there? We need space near the cake table." I hesitated, clutching Oliver's gift. I came to celebrate, not coat duty. She tilted her head, smile fixed. "Everyone helps. Please." So I carried armfuls of strangers' jackets to a corner, each trip a little heavier than the last. My gift felt suddenly small in my bag, my presence smaller still. When Oliver spotted me, his face lit like a sparkler. He ran,
hugging me tight. "Grandma, you came?"
His joy was pure, undiluted by adult bitterness. I kissed his hair, inhaling sugar and shampoo. That moment alone was worth every humiliation to come. But humiliation came quickly. When it was time for cake, Rebecca clapped her hands. "Let's gather!" "Mom, could you pass out the plates?" She thrust a stack at me, not waiting for an answer. I stood in the crowd, balancing paper and forks while laughter and phones clicked photos. No one offered to help. I felt like a waitress at my own family's table. Then came the speech. Rebecca tapped a glass. "We're so grateful everyone came. Oliver is lucky to have such support." She gestured at her in-laws, showering them with praise for organizing, baking, decorating. Not once did she mention me. Not the grandmother who had sewn his first Halloween costume. Not the woman who taught him to read. I was erased with a smile. The sting burned worse when a cousin whispered near me, "Not low enough. Why is she even here? She looks lost." Laughter rippled, casual, cutting. My ears rang. My hands shook. A plate slipped and clattered, frosting smearing the floor. All heads turned. Rebecca's voice sliced the air. "Mom, please, try to be careful." The words hung, light on the surface, sharp underneath. Guests exchanged glances. I wanted the ground to open, to swallow me whole. But I did not cry. I bent, cleaned the mess with napkins, my spine stiff. Inside, a voice steady as stone told me, "Do not give them tears. Give them memory." Every insult was evidence, every omission a mark on the record of my dignity's theft. Later, when Oliver opened gifts, he tore into mine eagerly. "Grandma gave me this?" he shouted, holding up the book. His joy flickered across faces briefly. Rebecca's smile tightened. "Books are thoughtful?" she said, as if the word thoughtful were a synonym for useless. Parents laughed politely. Oliver hugged the book anyway, whispering, "We'll read it together." That promise poured balm on my wounds. As the hall emptied, I helped stack chairs. Rebecca came near, voice low. "You embarrassed me tonight," dropping things. Hovering. People noticed. Her nails clicked against her phone screen. "You can't keep showing up like this. It reflects badly." I met her gaze. For the first time in months, my fear shrank. "Reflected light shows what's already there," I said. She blinked, uncomprehending or unwilling to understand. Then she turned away, heels sharp on the linoleum. Driving home, rain finally fell. Drops drummed the windshield, each one a metronome to my thoughts. Shame wrestled with anger, anger with resolve. They had tried to reduce me to a servant, an embarrassment, a shadow, but humiliation can harden into something else. Quietly, in that storm, I knew I would not be erased. At home, I laid the napkin I had used to wipe frosting into my shoebox of evidence. It smelled faintly of sugar, stained with humiliation. But to me, it was proof. Proof of what they did when they thought no one would remember. Proof I would carry forward. The clock ticked past midnight. Outside, rain tapped the gutters. Inside, I whispered to myself, "Not forgotten, not erased. Not yet." The words built a wall inside me, brick by brick, and as I drifted towards sleep, another thought pressed close, steady, undeniable. This was not the end. It was only the start of their reckoning. What about you? If your own child treated you like a burden at a family gathering, would you fight back, or stay silent and endure? Comment your thoughts below. Your words may help someone who feels invisible tonight. The humiliation from Oliver's party clung to me like the smell of frosting gone sour. Days passed, but the echo of laughter at my expense kept replaying. I tried to busy myself with cleaning, cooking for one, folding clothes that never seemed to wear out. Yet in quiet moments, doubt sharpened into suspicion. Something about Rebecca's tone, her dismissive words, "You can't keep showing up like this," had carried more than shame. It had carried ownership. Ownership of me. Ownership of what was mine. One rainy afternoon, I decided to sort through my desk. Bills, old letters, photographs lay scattered across the wood grain. That's when I noticed it, a bank statement folded differently from the rest, tucked between outdated tax forms. My name was there, but so was Rebecca's, listed as primary contact. I frowned, tracing the ink with my finger. I had never added her. Never signed over authority. My chest tightened. Something was off. That night sleep refused me. I lay listening to the storm whip against the windows, the clock hammering every second. Memories surfaced. Rebecca urging me, weeks earlier, to just sign this, Mom. It'll make things easier. I had waved her off then, too tired to argue. But had I? Or had she? I sat up, heart pounding. Could she have forged my name? The next morning, I dressed in gray slacks and a wool coat. The air outside bit sharp, December cold, but inside me burned something hotter, resolve. I drove to the local bank where my husband and I had opened our first account decades earlier. The lobby smelled of floor polish and printer ink. A fake plant sagged in the corner. Behind glass, tellers smiled with practiced cheer. I asked for a meeting with the manager. Mr. Talbot, gray-haired and brisk, led me into his office. His desk was neat, except for a pen tapping rhythmically against a folder. "How can I help you, Mrs. Lane?" I slid the statement across. "Why is my daughter's name here?" He adjusted his glasses, flipped through. "It appears she's listed as co-owner. Authorization signed 2 months ago." He turned the paper for me to see. And there it was, my signature. Or rather, something pretending to be it. The loops too wide, the letters leaning the wrong way. I felt my stomach drop. "That is not my hand," I whispered. My pulse thudded in my ears. "I never signed this." "Mr." Talbot cleared his throat. "Forgery is a serious accusation. If you'd like, we can request handwriting verification, and you may want to contact legal counsel." I nodded, though my hands trembled in my lap. Anger warred with sorrow. My own daughter had reached into my life, my accounts, and carved out her piece as if I were already gone. She hadn't even waited for me to die. The betrayal felt like a blade, but it also lit a fire. I was not powerless. Not yet. I asked for copies of every related document. Mr. Talbot hesitated, then obliged. The papers slid into a manila envelope. I clutched it to my chest like armor. Before leaving, I glanced at him. "Don't tell her I came. Please." He met my eyes, then nodded slowly. "Of course." Driving home, the world looked different. Streetlights seemed harsher, the snow dirtier, every shadow filled with suspicion. My own daughter was plotting against me. But instead of collapsing into despair, I felt a strange clarity. For months, I had been drifting, waiting for her love to return. Now I knew her love had been replaced by ambition. And ambition had signatures. At home, I laid the envelope on the kitchen table. The papers whispered when I spread them out: dates, names, false agreements. One line caught me. The clause stating the co-owner could sell property without notice. My house. The very home I had worked a lifetime to keep standing. Rebecca was preparing to take it, brick by brick, memory by memory. I pressed my palms against the wood. Tears finally came, sliding hot across my cheeks. But beneath them, something stronger took root. The humiliation at the party, the loneliness of winter nights, all of it sharpened into a single truth: I could not wait to be rescued. I had to rescue myself. I gathered every scrap of evidence: old wills, receipts, photographs of documents Rebecca once waved at me. I placed them in a shoebox already holding that stained napkin from the party. Each item was a piece of my story, proof that I mattered, proof that I remembered, proof she couldn't erase. When night fell, I sat by the window, envelope in my lap. Outside, the snow reflected the moon like shards of glass. Inside, I felt both fragile and unbreakable. Rebecca thought she held the pen to rewrite my life, but she had forgotten. I still owned the paper. The clock ticked. Midnight passed. My hands, though wrinkled, felt steady. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like a victim waiting for kindness. I felt like a witness gathering truth, and with truth, power begins. Tomorrow, I would decide what to do with these papers. But tonight, I only whispered one word into the dark: enough. The papers lay on my kitchen table like silent enemies. Inked dates, forged loops of my name. Rebecca's ambition bleeding across every page. I should have been exhausted, but instead my body refused rest. The house was quiet except for the clock hammering each second into my chest. Midnight became 1 o'clock, then 2, and still I sat in the half-light, my fingers brushing the manila envelope as though it might vanish if I let go. The living room smelled faintly of chamomile from a cup of tea gone cold. I had brewed it hours earlier, hoping it would soothe me, but bitterness coated my tongue instead. Outside, wind rattled the gutters, shaking dead leaves across the porch. My eyes burned, not only from sleeplessness, but from grief sharpened into anger. I closed them and memories came. My husband Robert, sitting in this same kitchen decades ago, his voice steady as a metronome. "Maggie, always read before you sign, and never give away what you worked for." He had been a man of few words, but every one still echoed. I pictured his broad hands guiding Oliver's tiny ones across a fishing line, his laugh when the boy pulled up a sunfish. Those were the roots of our life, the house, the savings, the small securities we had planted together, and now Rebecca was pulling them up like weeds. Sleep would not come, so I rose and began to move through the house. Each room whispered history, the smell of lemon polish on the banister, the faint creak of the upstairs floor where Oliver used to race his toy trucks, the faded curtains Robert once insisted were good enough. These walls were not just wood and paint. They were memory, dignity. To lose them would be to lose myself. I sat at my husband's old desk and opened a fresh notebook. My pen hovered, shaky at first. Then words began to flow, short notes, half-formed plans. Names of neighbors who had witnessed Rebecca's coldness. Phone numbers of old friends who still called to check in. A reminder: contact legal aid. Another: make extra copies. The more I wrote, the clearer my breath became. The night was heavy, but inside me, a strange light began to grow. At 3 a.m., I walked back to the kitchen and spread out the shoebox where I had been storing my small archive. Napkin from the party, receipts. Now the bank documents. I added tonight's notebook page, folding it carefully. My hands shook less this time. Evidence, memory, plan, 3 pillars to lean on. But fear pressed close. What if Rebecca found out I had gone to the bank? What if she came storming through this door tomorrow, demanding answers, twisting lies until even the neighbors believed her? My chest tightened. For a moment I wanted to hide, to pretend none of it was happening. Then I thought of Oliver, clutching that book I had given him, whispering, "We'll read it together." His trust was my anchor. For him, I had to fight. I returned to the desk, turned a lamp toward the wall, and stared at the shadows it cast. One looked like Robert's profile, stern, calm. I spoke aloud, voice trembling. "I can't let her erase me, Rob. I can't let her take what we built." Silence answered, but in that silence, I felt something steady, as though his hand still rested over mine. My tears fell, but they no longer weakened me. They washed me clean. The hours crawled. At dawn, pale light seeped through the blinds, gray as unpolished silver. Birds stirred outside, their cries sharp and insistent. I hadn't slept a minute, yet I felt sharper than I had in months. Resolve had replaced fatigue. My reflection in the kitchen window startled me, wrinkled, wary, but eyes burning. The kind of fire that comes when you finally stop waiting for kindness and decide to carve justice yourself. I made fresh tea, drank it hot this time, and stared again at the papers. Rebecca thought she had trapped me. She believed I was too fragile, too naive to notice. But I had noticed, and what I held now was leverage. Quiet, powerful leverage. I opened the notebook again, underlined one line 3 times. Call attorney? Monday. Then, below it, I wrote another, slower. They will not win. The words steadied me. I could almost hear Robert's voice again, deep and sure. Fight with your head, Maggie, not just your heart. When the clock struck 7, I was still at the table, the shoebox of evidence beside me. Sunlight finally broke through, splintering across the floorboards. Dust motes danced in the beam like tiny witnesses rising. I closed my notebook, placed my pen on top, and pressed both hands flat against the cover. I whispered into the stillness, "It begins now?" An idea was forming in the back of my mind, risky, quiet, and final. By the time the next night came, I would know if I was strong enough to act on it. By the time the second dawn rose, I no longer felt like prey. Exhaustion still tugged at my bones, but beneath it pulsed a steadier current, resolve. Rebecca had made her move. Now it was my turn. The first step was quiet, deliberate. Monday morning, I walked into the same bank where I had uncovered her forgery. The marble floor smelled faintly of lemon polish. The air cool with the hum of vents. I carried my shoebox of evidence pressed to my chest. The teller's smile faltered when I asked again for the manager. "Mr. Talbot greeted me with wary politeness, his pen already tapping. "I need the ownership revoked," I said, my voice low but firm, effective immediately. He studied me, then the papers. "It will take legal verification. But if you retain counsel, we can freeze certain privileges." His words clicked into me like puzzle pieces. Freeze, verify, retain. I nodded even as fear skittered across my ribs. This was how the fight began, not with shouting, but with quiet signatures. From there, I drove across town to a small law office tucked between a bakery and a hardware store. The bell above the door chimed. The room smelled of paper and coffee left too long on a burner. Attorney Hill was younger than I expected, sandy-haired, glasses slipping down his nose. He listened as I explained, his brows knitting tighter with each detail. Forgery, power of attorney, misrepresentation, intent to defraud. He murmured, tapping notes. "You've kept excellent documentation." He glanced at the shoebox. "That will matter?" For the first time in weeks, I felt seen. Not as a burden, not as fragile. As a woman who had evidence, voice, and will. We filed immediate paperwork. Copies churned from the printer, warm and smelling of toner. I signed each page with deliberate care, remembering Robert's old warning. Never give away what you worked for. The attorney assured me temporary holds would be placed, and formal hearings could follow. My assets, my house, my dignity, they were not lost, not yet. The second step was preparation. At home, I began cataloging every artifact of betrayal, Rebecca's text messages, overheard remarks, notes she left behind. Each went into labeled folders. I created a system Robert would have approved of. Neat, ordered, undeniable. Evidence became my ally. It steadied me at night when fear prowled the corners of my mind. I also began withdrawing from her reach in smaller, quieter ways. I stopped forwarding utility bills through shared accounts. I canceled the automatic transfer she had convinced me was easier. I called the insurance office and removed her name from correspondence. Each act was a stitch pulled from the fabric of her control. Each click of the phone, each envelope sealed, was a whisper of defiance. You will not erase me." Days turned into weeks, and still I moved silently. Neighbors noticed I kept to myself, but when they stopped by with casseroles or fresh bread, I accepted with gratitude, storing away more than food. I stored goodwill, witnesses, proof that I was not as alone as Rebecca wanted me to be. One afternoon, I drove to the public library, the one Rebecca had scoffed at as obsolete. I sat at a wooden desk that smelled faintly of dust and varnish, and I scrolled through legal resources on an old desktop computer. The keys clapped beneath my fingers, steady as a heartbeat. Knowledge was another weapon. The more I read, the stronger I felt. Quiet justice required quiet preparation. But even as I built my plan, a shadow of doubt lingered. Could I withstand the storm once Rebecca discovered the truth? Could I face her fury, her manipulation, her ability to twist family against me? At night, those questions circled like wolves. Yet each morning, when I returned to my notebook, I wrote the same line first: "They will not win." The third step was courage. It wasn't loud, it wasn't theatrical. It was steady, like showing up at the courthouse with folders neatly stacked. Like answering Attorney Hill's calls with confidence, like rehearsing what I would say if Rebecca confronted me. I practiced in the mirror, voice steady. "You tried to take what isn't yours, but I am not finished." Each repetition chipped away at fear. One evening, I sat on the porch with Oliver. He was quiet, sensing the weight I carried. When he finally asked, "Grandma, are you okay?" I smiled, though my throat burned. "I'm stronger than they think," I told him, and for once I believed it. By the end of that month, my quiet plan had become a fortress, legal steps in motion. Finances shielded, evidence secured, allies informed. Rebecca still thought she held the upper hand, but I knew better. She was building her empire on forged ink, and I had gathered the fire to burn it down. The night before our first legal appointment, I spread the folders across my kitchen table. The lamplight glowed against the papers, and I breathed in their sharp scent of ink and effort. Each page was a promise, to myself, to Robert, to Oliver, that I would not go quietly. I pressed my hands flat on the table, steady as stone. For months, they had called me fragile, invisible, a burden. But the truth was written here, bold and undeniable. Tomorrow, Rebecca would learn she was not the only one who knew how to wield a pen. And now, dear listener, I want to ask you, if the people you trusted most tried to erase you, would you stay silent, or would you build your own quiet plan? Share your thoughts. You never know whose story your voice might save. The morning of the hearing broke clear and cold, as if the sky itself had been scrubbed for the occasion. Frost clung to my windshield, glittering like glass splinters. I sat in the driver's seat a long time before starting the engine, my shoebox of evidence buckled into the passenger chair like a companion. The steering wheel was cold under my hands, but my pulse ran hot. This was the day. The courthouse in Montpelier smelled of stone and polish, the air faintly metallic, like coins kept too long in a pocket. I walked slowly up the steps, every footfall echoing. My attorney, Mr. Hill, met me at the entrance, folders tucked under his arm. His greeting was short. "We're ready?" And for once, I felt that I was too. Inside the hearing room, light poured from high windows, bright enough to show every speck of dust floating between us. Rebecca sat at the long table, her hair sleek, her smile sharpened like glass. She wore a navy suit that screamed success. When she looked at me, her expression carried the same dismissive curve I had known all my life, the look that said I was small, fragile, expendable. But behind her, 2 chairs sat empty. Oliver wasn't there, nor were the neighbors who had promised to attend. Not yet. My chest tightened. Was I standing alone again? The clerk shuffled papers, the sound loud as wings. "Case number 7040B, he announced. Lane versus Lane, my daughter's last name. My name. It struck me how easily blood could be split into sides. Mr. Hill began with steady words, his voice measured as he outlined Rebecca's forged signatures, the unauthorized transfers, the attempted sale of property. Each document slid across the polished table with a crisp sound. Rebecca's attorney, sleek, fast-talking, objected, deflected, claimed confusion. But then came the photographs of bank ledgers, the receipts, and finally the copy of Rebecca's own text. "Handle it yourselves. I'm busy." The words burned in the silent room. Rebecca shifted in her chair, her confident smile twitching. "She's exaggerating," she said, her voice tight. "My mother doesn't understand finance. She's always been fragile." Her eyes flicked toward me, expecting me to wilt. Instead, I straightened. My hands did not shake when I reached for the folder. Fragile. My voice cut through the hush. Fragile women don't keep records for months. Fragile women don't walk into banks and ask questions. Fragile women don't sit up nights building a plan. I slid the folder forward. This is not fragility. This is a survival. The judge's eyes, rimmed with tiredness, lifted to study me. In that moment, I felt Robert's steady hand at my back and Oliver's quiet faith. My spine lengthened, the hush deepened. Even Rebecca's attorney looked momentarily caught off guard. Then, the door opened. Oliver slipped in, clutching a folder of his own. Behind him, two neighbors followed, coats dusted with snow, faces resolute. My throat tightened as he took a seat behind me. Rebecca's gaze snapped toward him, shock flaring across her face. She hadn't expected witnesses. She hadn't expected loyalty to fall away from her. Oliver rose when the judge allowed. His voice, young but steady, carried through the room. "I've seen what my mother has tried to do. I've seen the way she talks to Grandma, how she treats her. And I found this." He placed his folder on the table. Inside were copies of messages, notes, even a recording he had made one night. The words dripped with contempt. Rebecca mocking me, planning to liquidate assets, laughing about the old woman being too slow to notice. The silence after was heavier than stone. Rebecca flushed red, then pale, her hands clenching in fists. "Oliver?" she hissed. "You're a child. You don't know what you're doing." But his chin lifted, and he didn't sit down. Mr. Hill gathered the pieces, tying them together with the calm precision of a craftsman. "Your Honor," he concluded, "this is not a matter of misunderstanding. It is a matter of calculated betrayal." The judge tapped his pen once, twice. His words came slow, deliberate. "Until further ruling, all accounts are to be frozen in Ms. Lane's name. Sole authority reverts to Mrs. Margaret Lane. Pending further investigation, powers of attorney granted to Rebecca Lane are null and void." His gavel struck wood, the sound like thunder cracking. For a long moment, no one breathed. Then I let out the breath I had been holding for months. The papers, the sleepless nights, the quiet plan, it had all built to this. Justice was not final yet, but the tide had turned. I was no longer invisible. Rebecca leaned forward, eyes burning. "You think this is over?" Her whisper cut like a knife. "You've humiliated me." I met her gaze calm. "No, Rebecca. You humiliated yourself. You did it when you chose greed over family." My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The truth had already been spoken. She recoiled as though struck. Her attorney muttered about appeals, about strategy, but the sharpness in his tone told me he knew the ground was gone beneath them. As we rose to leave, Oliver slipped his hand into mine. His grip was warm, steady. "You did it, Grandma," he whispered. I shook my head gently. "We did it? And it's not finished yet?" We walked out into the winter air, cold biting at our cheeks. But inside, I felt something fierce and alive. Justice had cracked open the silence. The rest would follow. Yet as the courthouse doors closed behind me, I knew fallout was coming. Rebecca would not retreat quietly, and peace, if it came, would have its own cost. The courthouse steps still carried the echo of the gavel. Every footstep down felt lighter, though the cold air bit into my cheeks. Rebecca's voice still rang in my ears, sharp, venomous, promising retaliation. Yet beneath it, I carried something steadier. Justice, not final but firm. I had survived the storm. That night, my kitchen glowed with lamplight. The evidence folders, once scattered across the table, were stacked neatly in a box. The air smelled of chamomile tea, steam curling against the window. Oliver sat across from me, his shoulders slumped from a day heavier than his years. "She'll never forgive me?" he said quietly. I went against my own mother. I reached for his hand. "You told the truth. Sometimes that costs more than silence. But you gave me back my voice." His eyes shimmered, and I saw the boy who used to run through my yard chasing fireflies, not the young man torn between loyalty and justice. In that moment, I knew the fracture in our family would not heal easily. But something new had begun. The days that followed were quieter. Rebecca's calls stopped, though messages still arrived. Angry, clipped, threatening lawsuits she couldn't afford. I didn't answer. Silence became my shield. Each morning I brewed coffee, its nutty aroma filling the kitchen, and read the paper without waiting for her shadow to appear. For the first time in years, the house felt like mine again. Neighbors dropped by more often. Mrs. Keating from across the street brought over cornbread. Still warm, its buttery scent lingering in the hallway. Mr. Daniels offered to salt my driveway when the snow came. Their gestures reminded me of a truth Rebecca had refused to see. Family isn't only bound by blood. It's bound by kindness freely given. Oliver moved into the spare bedroom, the one Rebecca used to call junk storage. He cleared it out himself, hauling boxes to the attic. One evening, I found him hanging a small photo of Robert, taken long before the illness. The frame caught the light, and for a moment, the room felt whole again. "He should be here?" Oliver whispered. I nodded. "He is." The legal work continued in the background, hearings scheduled, accounts secured, Rebecca's objections filed and swiftly denied. But inside me, the war was over. I no longer paced at night or jolted awake to the echo of her insults. Instead, I tended the garden, even in winter, trimming dead stems while the cold earth promised spring. The soil smelled rich, grounding. My hands, though wrinkled, felt strong. One Sunday, Oliver and I walked to the library I had dedicated years ago. Children's laughter echoed through the halls, the scent of old paper thick in the air. A little girl tugged at her father's sleeve, holding a picture book. I watched her, and my chest tightened with a quiet pride. Rebecca had wanted to sell this place, strip it for profit. Instead, it breathed with life. That was legacy, not money, not control, but stories carried forward. There were moments of ache, of course. Holidays arrived with fewer chairs filled. The absence of my daughter sat heavy, like a missing tooth the tongue cannot stop tracing. But instead of collapsing into that loss, I set an extra plate for Oliver, sometimes for a neighbor too. We lit candles, passed dishes, laughed at simple jokes. The clink of silverware felt like defiance against the silence Rebecca had tried to impose. One evening, snow fell thick outside. Oliver and I sat by the fire, the wood crackling, the air sharp with pine smoke. He asked, "Do you think she'll come back?" I stared into the flames. "She might, but she won't come back the same. And neither will I." The fire popped, sparks rising like fleeting stars. I knew reconciliation might never come. But peace didn't require her return. It required my release. The calm didn't mean weakness. It meant choosing what deserved space in my life. I stopped explaining myself, stopped rehearsing arguments in my head. I chose quiet mornings, honest conversations, and the steady beat of my own dignity. For the first time in decades, I felt fully present in my own skin. When I stepped outside one morning, frost glittered across the yard, every blade of grass tipped with light. My breath hung in the air, steady, visible. The world had not ended. It had changed, yes, but in the cracks left by betrayal, something new had grown: resilience. The kind you don't need to shout about. The kind you live. Rebecca's shadow still lingered on the edges of thought, but it no longer defined me. My story had turned, not with revenge shouted across a room, but with justice quietly secured, with dignity reclaimed. And in that quiet, I found calm, not as surrender, but as strength. Yet deep inside, a question stirred. What kind of legacy would I leave beyond survival? The answer waited in the next chapter of my life. Chapter 12, Epilogue. Healing. Spring came slow to Vermont that year, but when it arrived, it painted everything new. The first shoots of crocus pushed through the thawed ground, stubborn and bright. I stood on my porch, mug of coffee warming my palms, and watched the yard fill with color. For the first time in a long while, I felt as if the seasons moved with me, not against me. The storm with Rebecca had settled into silence. She had moved farther away, chasing work and ambition, sending only the occasional letter through her attorney. There was no apology, no olive branch. And maybe there never would be. I stopped waiting for her shadow to darken my door. Instead, I looked toward the light that remained. Oliver thrived. He had taken a part-time job at the library, helping children with reading circles. His laughter filled the halls, mixing with the rustle of turning pages. Sometimes I sat quietly at the back, listening. The smell of old books, ink, and polished wood wrapped around me like a shawl. I thought of Robert then, of all the nights he read aloud while Oliver curled on the rug. The chain of voices passing stories from one generation to another hadn't broken. It had changed form. And maybe that was what legacy truly was, not keeping everything the same, but making sure something survived. I spent afternoons in the garden. The air smelled of fresh soil and lilacs. The sun warm on my shoulders. My hands ached sometimes, joints stiff, but I wore the ache like a medal. Each blossom reminded me that even what seems dead can bloom again. I wasn't simply filling time, I was planting tomorrow. Neighbors came by often, children picked tomatoes, Mrs. Keating carried home bundles of herbs, Mr. Daniels taught Oliver how to patch a fence. Their voices filled the space Rebecca had once emptied. Family, I learned, could be chosen. It could grow outward like vines, unexpected and resilient. On Sundays, the kitchen turned into a gathering place. I baked pies with Oliver, the scent of cinnamon clinging to the air. Laughter drifted through the house, bouncing off walls that had once heard only silence. The table no longer felt like an arena of judgment, but a place of welcome. People came hungry and left fed, not just with food but with belonging. And in their eyes, I saw myself not as fragile, but as steady. I thought back off into that hospital bed, the beeping machines, the words that had cut me so deeply. I'm busy. It had felt then like abandonment, like an ending. But endings can be beginnings in disguise. That moment pushed me toward a truth I might never have faced otherwise. That my worth had never depended on one person's care or one family bond. My worth lived in my choices, my dignity, my ability to rise after being struck down. Rebecca's betrayal had been sharp, but it had also stripped me of illusions. It showed me who I could be when no one came to save me. It showed me the quiet power of resilience. And in that way, though I wouldn't thank her, I could admit she had given me a strange kind of gift. One evening, Oliver asked me, "Grandma, do you ever wish things had turned out different?" We were sitting on the porch, fireflies sparking across the yard. I thought carefully before answering. Different. Maybe easier, yes. But easier isn't always better. Pain carved out space I didn't know I had. And now that space holds strength. Holds you. Holds the stories we'll leave behind. He nodded, leaning his head on my shoulder. The weight was light, but grounding. As summer stretched on, I began hosting small storytelling nights at the library. Women my age gathered, voices trembling at first, then steady. They shared tales of loss, of betrayal, of unexpected healing. Their words filled the room with warmth, with recognition. I watched the younger ones listen, wide-eyed, as if realizing for the first time that aging wasn't disappearance, but transformation. Each voice was a lantern lit against the dark. That, I realized, would be my legacy. Not just a building, not just a garden, but a circle of voices refusing to be silenced. We were proof that it was never too late to reclaim dignity. That betrayal could break you, but it could also build you into something unshakable. Autumn would come again, and winter after that. Seasons always turned, but I no longer feared them. Each carried its own beauty, its own lesson, and in the quiet, I had found more than survival. I had found peace. So if you're listening now, if you've been made to feel small, invisible, or abandoned, remember this: your story is not over. You are not alone. Share your story, because every voice deserves to be heard, and every scar can become a line in the song of legacy. Healing isn't forgetting, It's choosing what stays and what no longer owns you. I chose love, community, and dignity. And that choice, more than anything Rebecca could take from me, is mine forever. In the end, I learned that betrayal does not define me. My response does. I chose calm over chaos, dignity over despair, and love over bitterness. And in that choice, I found healing, I found freedom, and I found a legacy that will outlive the silence Rebecca left behind.